Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends. I'm here with my friend Jake Curtis, and Jake and I are continuing our series on Bible study tools and how to use them. This is part 2, and today we're going to specifically talk about answering the what and when question. When we're going along, we talked about last week the questions of who, what, when, where, why, and we talked about tools for finding out what does that mean. And today we're going to talk about a couple other tools. Now, I like to do this when I'm coming to a book like the Gospel of John. I'm going to use that as an example in a second. I like to ask myself the question, who's John? Do I know? What do I know about John? And we're going to answer that question and some tools for that when we come right back. Hi, and welcome back to Bible Study with Friends. So I said, I'm here with my friend Jake Curtis. How you doing, Jake?
Good. How are you doing?
You ready to get into the next?
I am excited for it.
Yeah, it'll be good. And we'll be talking about those today. Now, the free tools that we've talked about as far as our questions in our own minds and the tools that we get from a free dictionary on these are done. We're really done with the free tools. Now, these will be tools that we can purchase either in a used bookstore or purchase new in a Christian bookstore or use online. And we're going to talk about those as we get into this. Answering the who and when question. So let's get into this. I want to show you an example. I come to the book of John, the Gospel of John, and I want to know about John, and I can find out. You can see in these notes that I find out who his father and mother were, who his brothers were, how many books of the Bible he wrote, what his relationship was with Jesus. We can find out all this stuff. And I make my notes up here. As I'm reading the Gospel of John, I have a good feeling of who wrote it. Because I come to the Gospel of John and I go, who wrote the Gospel of John? That's a question like who's buried in George Washington's grave. John wrote the book of John. But what do I know about John? Now, a lot of us would say he's an apostle. What else do we know about him? And we find out some interesting things, like he's Jesus' cousin. And on the Last Supper, he literally is leaning on Jesus. Some interesting facts about that. We find out that his father and mother were Zebedee and his wife Salome. And anyway, we find out interesting things, and they're good for us as we're reading the book of John, that we have a background of who John is. And also in our looking up of when, we find out right here, we see that John was written approximately 85 AD. And we see that in our notes there. See right here where John, I wrote a note down here. Now, he writes 5 books of the New Testament. There's 27 books in the New Testament, so about 25% of the New Testament is written by John. We can name those: the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and the book of Revelation. And 25% of the New Testament's nothing to sneeze at. Paul writes, I think, 13 books, and so he writes almost 50% of the New Testament. So between John and Paul, you have major authors of the New Testament.
Yeah.
And he writes this, our notes say he writes this about 85 AD. And some scholars say that it could be as late as 95 AD. So we find out that John is the last gospel written. All the other gospels are written between 40 and 60 AD. But this one is the last one. So we find out some what or who, and we find out some when questions. Now, one of the tools that we use for finding out some things about the who and the what is a tool called a Bible handbook. Now, they're published all over the place. You can also, sometimes they're not called a Bible handbook. Sometimes they're called an overview of the Bible. And that's what a Bible handbook is. Now, my favorite Bible handbook, it's a simple little book. It's Haley's Bible and it's a good source. And I'll show you an example of this. Let me show you a page from, let's say you come to the book of Jude, and this says who Jude is, and this will give you a good example. And for any book, it'll go through all of the books of the Bible, and it'll say, okay, Jude, this is written by Jude, who Jude is, the place and time that he writes. He writes it in parallel. It's written about the same time and about the same issues as Second Peter, and it gives you some cross references. It's probably written about 67 AD. The occasion for writing, he was going to write about something else, and he writes about this. So you'd find out those sorts of things. And then it gives a very quick, very concise outline of the book of Titus. So from verse 4 to 19 is false teachers. Then that goes down here. And then you go to the next page. Verse 6 talks about fallen angels. Verse 9 talks about Michael's contention with the devil. Verse 14 and 15 talk about prophecy of Enoch. So this kind of gives you an idea of what's in a book, who wrote it, when it was written. So it's a good little tool, a Bible handbook. And there are a number of them. That was just an example of Haley's Bible handbook that I use. That makes sense? Any questions up to this point? See how they answer the who and when question?
Yeah, that answers. Yeah, I think that does. But how did they find those answers? These scholars who wrote the books, is that just through research? And
these are put together by scholars who have got PhDs and have studied the background of these books for years. So Haley's Bible Handbook and some others. We talked about Zondervan is a good publisher. Baker is a good publisher. Another good one is Victor, especially Baker and Victor are great publishers for tools. If you see a Victor or Baker, it's going to be a reference book. They don't do a lot of devotionals and that kind of stuff. So these are put together. They find out because they have researched this. Some of them have their PhDs in the book of Judas or the book of Titus or whatever. Yeah. So it can be very informative. And these are tools for us to be able to go to as lay people and not have to spend years doing a PhD in that. It gives us a good idea. So it's important to use trusted sources. And that's what I'm talking about. Now, another source for finding out about the who and the when question. Who is writing it? Who is he writing to? Who is he writing about? When is he writing? And roughly, what is he writing about? Another source, besides a handbook, I like to go to the handbook first. I like to use a Bible dictionary. You look up John in a good Bible dictionary, and you're going to find cross references. He was Jesus' cousin, and there'll be verses about how we know that. But after we look through this and we start to look and get our answers, another tool is a Bible commentary. Now, a lot of Christians, when they're doing a Bible study, they go right to a Bible commentary, and that's all they read is just the Bible commentary. And whoever puts it together, it's basically his opinion of what these verses mean. Now, it's an educated opinion, but it's an opinion nonetheless. Okay? And the Bible commentary, let me show you an example of a Bible commentary from my software. This is a Bible commentary on the book of John, and is a great commentary that I happen to really love. This is the title page. It's the Bible Knowledge Commentary, and it's put out by the staff of Dallas Theological Seminary. And that's a great, solid, doctrinally deal. And this is an Old Testament and New Testament. So if you go down to the Gospel of John, I'm going to do this very quickly for you. There it is. This particular commentary is put together by Edwin Bloom. You can look him up. He's on staff was on staff at Dallas Theological Seminary. Now, the authorship, it'll tell you who the authors were. And you notice all these cross references. That's what I use a commentary for, is these cross references. In fact, that's how to know if it's a good commentary, is if you open it and you see all kinds of cross references. You see these? So it'll say something like, John was Jesus' cousin, and then it'll give you a bunch of verses so that you can go and look them up. Now in my software in Logos, it's really fast because I can go to John's brother died in the year 40. He was not the author. You can look up a verse here. He had James, the brother of John, put to death. So we find out that James, the first apostle to die, was John's brother. Now that's interesting because John's brother James is the first apostle to die, but we find out that John is the last apostle to die and the only apostle that dies a natural death. And you find that out through these kinds of notes. That makes sense? And then it keeps going. The place and origin of where the book of John was written, the date, it gives you all kinds of information. Here's that between 85 and 95 AD, right? The date, the purpose of the gospel. So there's a lot of notes. So you could say, I'm going to start to do a Bible study in the book of John. You could do a study in source material for an hour before you read the very first verse, just to get a feel. Who's the author? When was it written? Now, then we get into later here, we get into an outline. So I might go into this and use it to make notes in the outline so I can tell when I'm studying the book of John what I'm looking at. So you can see an outline. I like to use those. Now, here's where you get a commentary, and then it goes into the verses specifically, verse 1:1, and then it gives you some information. And it gets into culture. It gets into all kinds of backgrounds. And that's the good use of a commentary, just background material. That makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So the two big tools to use to answer the who wrote it, who was he written to, who was he written about, and when was it written, and what were the circumstances really, are the tools of a Bible handbook and a Bible commentary. And I've made those recommendations to you on some good ones. I probably have, in my Bible software, I probably have 15 different Bible commentaries. And it helps to do research quickly when you're using software. I remember when I was doing old school, I'd be doing a Bible study, and we've already talked about this. I have my Bible open. I'd have a Merriam-Webster's dictionary open. I'd have a Bible dictionary open. I'd have a Bible handbook open and a commentary open. So I'd have a desk full of books. We're using software. I could push a button and look up cross references and things like that. So those are our tools that I would recommend for answering those who, what, when, where, why questions. We looked last week at what does that word mean? This week we talked about who wrote that and when did he write it? What was he saying? And that's our tool. Next week, we're going to talk about a great tool, and that is a concordance. The importance of cross-referencing and how we use a concordance to find cross-references, and how to use the lexicon portion of the concordance to see the differences in the Hebrew and Greek words. And we're going to talk about that next week. If this has been a blessing to you, please subscribe and hit the like button, hit the little bell icon so you get a notation every time we do a new post. And I'd love to hear your comments about these tools. Have you ever used them? Have you gone deep? You can see by these tools, Jake, that you're reading along, you come to the book of John, you can dig deep for an hour on who John was, what about it? And then as you're reading the book, you can say, wow, this is Jesus' cousin, whoever, get an idea of some themes in the book of John as you get going. Make sense?
Makes sense.
Great tools. Any comments?
You could spend hours in these. I can tell already.
And that's why I said, no, I have never in 50 some years, I've never read through the Bible in one year, because it'd say, okay, read 3 chapters of the book of John, the first 3 chapters. I spend an hour finding out who John is and what the book's about, when it was written. Now, so all of a sudden, this was written in the 80s AD, and it's written about Jesus as the Messiah and believing Jesus as Messiah. So if you get some guy who says, oh, no, the church didn't believe Jesus was the Son of God and the Messiah until 400 years later. No. We have a book written in the first century that is very clear on who Jesus is and the Trinity and everything else. You see how that fits?
Yeah.
And where
Yeah.
the why and the when becomes so important, and help us study it. You can spend hours, and that's what Bible study is about, digging deep and really looking and then making your notes. And we'll talk more about that as we go through this series. Appreciate you guys listening, and appreciate you, Jake, for sitting in and listening to some of these tools. And as you use them, I want you to comment on them. All right. God bless you. See you next week.